Greetings collectors and welcome to today's retro game review. It's that time of year again, Christmas. These days I enjoy a simple Christmas, decorating the tree, playing with all the flashing lights and generally putting work aside for a bit in favour of relaxation, good food and the Muppets Christmas Carol. If you're a regular to the channel, you'll know that the Christmas episodes are not necessarily about a Christmas themed game, but of games that I would play as a child around the holidays. Usually those games needed a bit of extra time to enjoy, so the holiday period was the ideal time. This year I'd like to relive those magical memories of playing a game that still holds a special place in my gaming history. A game that's not only still fun to this day, but a game that also carries a strong anti-war message. So, throw another log on the fire, grab a mince pie, and gather round for a game that proved that even at Christmas, war has never been so much fun. Let's unwrap a game that can only be Sensible Software's masterpiece, Cannon Fodder. With its now legendary theme song, Cannon Fodder was released back in December of 1993, all ready for the holidays. The game was primarily aimed at the Commodore Amiga crowd, but it also found its way onto other platforms such as the Atari ST, MS-DOS, Acorn Archimedes, 3DO, Atari Jaguar, Sega Mega Drive and Genesis, the SNES, and the Game Boy Color. Yes, Cannon Fodder, despite essentially being a point-and-click game, hit all the right gameplay notes to receive widespread appeal. It's especially loved here in the UK, but did find a wider audience as time went by. The game was developed by the British developer Sensible Software, who were sort of a renegade band of coders. Looking back, they didn't have a large games library to their name, but everything they did release became an instant hit. Sensible's debut into the mainstream was a game called Whizball, a game I played to death back in the late 80s. It was your task to restore the colour to the world by shooting various enemies to power up and then collect the appropriate colour drops. The twist? You were a wizard that turns into a green ball thing, and your cat is the only one that can collect the colour drops after they've been turned into a satellite, a catalyte if you will. The game features very few of the trademark features that Sensible would become to be known for, but did see a mass release, and was incidentally one of the first Amiga games I played on Christmas morning back in 1989. It appeared in the 10-star pack bundle, sold with many Amigas and became a household name. 1991 saw the first big hit for Sensible Software though, in the way of Megalomania, a real-time strategy god sim-like game where you would level up tribes of small people to eventually attack your rivals and dominate the world. Again, the game was initially aimed at the Amiga fanbase, but saw successful releases on several 16-bit consoles. The game was well received by the magazines of the day, with scores consistently topping 90%. Megalomania is a game that really has now gone on to be rather forgotten by later generations. Games like The Settlers, Populous and Civ arguably went on to leave stronger real-time strategy legacies in the end. However, Megalomania had an even more important role to play than just being a decent real-time strategy. It introduced us to little people, doing things. The little people concept triggered the thought of, what about small football players? By 1992, Sensible Soccer was released. Tiny people playing football. It was a smash hit, and fundamental to what Sensible Software would become to be known for. There were in fact many editions of Sensible Soccer after the initial Commodore Amiga release, all of which helped lift the reputation of the Sensible team. Sensible Software were becoming known for being that small British developer with a sense of humour that could deliver. Perhaps not ready to take on America, but the UK was gripped in perhaps only a way that the Bitmap brothers could rival at the time. This leads us on to 1993 and the need to answer a question. Okay, what else can little people do? The Sensible Soccer engine was soon modified by the team for a new, deadly purpose. War was coming in one of the most controversial games of the decade. So, what's so controversial about Cannon Fodder? It's just tiny men shooting at each other, isn't it? Well, in fact, it's so much more than pixels. It's a social commentary, and a brilliant one at that. A lot of my viewers here in the UK will understand this straight away, but it is worth an explanation for the wider audience. Our game opens up in typical Sensible style, with a rather catchy yet ironic tune. War has never been so much fun. Nothing too controversial here, just good old British irony, as real war is certainly no fun at all. But then comes the red poppy, and the game's name, Cannon Fodder. The title may as well read Dead Soldiers. So, for those of you that aren't too familiar with history, we had a rather difficult time of it back between 1914 and 1918, as the First World War, also known as the Great War, ravaged our fragile peace. It was a war in which the Allied nations fought the central powers of the German, Austria-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. It's a little more complex than that obviously, but to cut a very long and complex story short, millions died on both sides in a long and drawn out war. Merry Christmas all! Anyway, back to the use of the iconic red poppy in Cannon Fodder, and why it raised more than an eyebrow with the media over here in the UK. You see, specifically the red poppy has a very particular meaning for some here. The British Legion website helps tell the story here. In 1915, Canadian Doctor Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae was inspired by the sight of poppies growing in battle-scarred fields to write his now famous poem, In Flanders Fields. He had recently lost a friend in the Battle of Ypres. The poem inspired American War Secretary Moyna Michael, who bought poppies to sell to her friends to raise money for servicemen in need after the First World War. This was adopted by the Royal British Legion in 1921, who ordered 9 million of these poppies and sold them on the 11th November that year in the first ever poppy appeal. The poppy has been adopted as a symbol of remembrance ever since. Since then, November 11th is known as Remembrance Sunday or Armistice Day here in the UK. Many mark the day by wearing a red poppy to remember our service personnel. There are also public services of remembrance at war memorials. Of course, this isn't unique to the UK, as many nations have very similar traditions of remembrance. However, the red poppy is very much associated with the British Legion, which in itself is a registered charity. In short, it's something to be respected and not really to be used for any commercial purposes. So, you can perhaps now see the problem of sticking the words Cannon Fodder next to the symbol of the Royal British Legion. Yes, it was irony, but not everyone was ready for this yet, despite the very prominent disclaimer. This disapproval was felt by the Legion themselves. The impact was doubled, as the game was first showcased on which day? That's right, Remembrance Day. As so often happens when people try to make a statement, it was not necessarily understood without context. Or at least it was chosen not to be understood by some of the British media. At the time, there was a media backlash, and the thoughts of the British Legion were made very clear in the national papers, particularly in the Daily Star. War veterans have slammed as monstrous a decision to use the Remembrance Day poppy to illustrate a new computer game called Cannon Fodder. The game, tipped to be the year's biggest seller, will make its debut at the show in London's Olympia from November 11th to 14th, Remembrance Sunday. Manufacturers Sensible Software say, "War has never been so much fun." The distinctive poppy symbol is featured on the game and on the front page of leading computer magazine Amiga Power, out on Armistice Day. British Legion chiefs and MPs have branded the use of the poppy as appalling. The editorial goes on to say, "The poppy is a sacred reminder of the men and women who gave their lives in 2 world wars. How sickening to see it being abused to sell a savage computer game. The distributors say the Poppy is there to remind the customer that war is no joke. That's just publicity writers' hypocrisy. Computer game designers compete to glorify war and viciousness. How dare they use the Poppy to turn truth on its head? Make sure you don't buy this shameful game. So, as you might imagine, by this point things were really starting to escalate, and the planned December 93 edition of Amiga Power backed out of using the planned Poppy cover in favour of a more generic screenshot. Amiga Power's deputy editor at the time, Stuart Campbell, did go on to write in the pre-publish edition, "Old soldiers, I wish them all dead." This was a very unfortunate turn of events, as this could have reflected badly on the Sensible Software team, who, by all accounts, must have been feeling that the anti-war irony message hadn't been understood. Thankfully, history tells a different story. A well thought out anti-war message wrapped up in the most hotly anticipated game of the year. Threats of legal battles rumbled on between the British Legion and Sensible Software, and the Poppy was ultimately removed from the Cannon Fodder box design in favour of a camouflage soldier, followed by cartoon soldiers in later editions. Richard Branson's Virgin Interactive proceeded to publish the game though, and it became an instant classic. The game swept to a clean sweep of 90% plus reviews from the magazines of the day, and was declared Game of the Year in Amiga Power. As with all gaming controversies, you have to look deeper at the game to understand the intention of the developers. Pre-launch had been a mixed bag of opinions, but it's important to look at the structure and content of the game itself if you really want to understand how sincere and deep the message of the futility of war really went. And with that, let's actually look at this masterpiece. Getting into the game, you're presented with a clean green hill as your recruits arrive, and are waved through the main gates. To make this personal, your team of Stu, Jules, Jops all make the draft, clearly named after the artist, Stu Cambridge, programmer, Jules Jameson, and the other Sensible Software staff. There were no nameless soldiers here, they were indeed sending themselves into war. The mission screen will give you a decent interlude before the action, and explain your main mission objectives. The game instantly grabs you. Simply left click to move the squad, and right click to fire. The guys were right, war has never been so much fun, or simpler for that matter. The levels proceed to get more challenging, and you're going to need to start using more tactics. For example, splitting your team may be beneficial, as a solo soldier can clear the way as a single target for the enemy. Of course, it's always great to bring in the backup when needed. To destroy the enemy buildings, you'll need to pick up grenades. Again, there are tactics that come into play. Do you blow up the ammo stash for that instant victory, or go for the more dangerous mission to collect the ammo, knowing full well that the building will be spawning more enemy soldiers as you approach? You also can't fire whilst in water, making you a sitting duck, so it's a good idea to split your team to either provide covering fire as sentries, or simply not put all your eggs in one basket. Things ramp up another level when the enemy decide to get out their rocket launchers. In these cases, it's always best to send in a solo hero, as a chain of soldiers will be wiped out very quickly. It's a game where you have to keep your wits about you, as the enemy, like yourselves, are quite small and camouflaged. Lose concentration for a moment, and it could be a bullet to the head. Jules! No! and should you be killed in action, you're not forgotten. Not only is there a roll of heroes, but a screen to remember the dead, by name. It's subtle, yet it's another element of the game that personalises the futility of war. The developers didn't have to put this in here, but they did. Add into this the new crosses that appear on the hill to mark the fallen. As a line of fresh-faced recruits report for duty, you realise the true genius of the anti-war message of the game. There will always be more cannon fodder. It's difficult to think of a game that does so much to make the subject of war fun, yet at the same time humanise the losses of war. It's a game that we're better off for. Of course, it helps that the Sensible team are also very likeable, and ultimately the themes of the game were taken to heart by gamers. Here I have the Commodore Amiga CD32 edition of the game, which, depending on your view, is perhaps the definitive edition of the game. The game offers excellent sound quality and everything you would expect from a slightly enhanced version of the Amiga 500 release. The biggest bonus being the FMV of the team larking around in the War video. If you saw this back in the day, I can guarantee you're feeling high levels of nostalgia right now. Yes, 352 by 288 pixels really will take you back to the good old days. This was a quirky team that you could put a face to, not a faceless money-making corporation. It's partly for this reason that the anti-war message was seen as sincere. In-game, the audio design really is excellent. The ambient sounds of the jungle are perfect, and there's a real sense of atmosphere despite the lack of music. Of course, none of any of this would matter if the game wasn't fun. Fortunately, it really is. The learning curve is reasonable, as elements are slowly added into the campaigns. Levels vary from small and frantic to much larger campaigns, and generally you'll be clicking away for a decent amount of time before feeling any repetition fatigue. You are also rewarded for perseverance and methodical gameplay, rather than just a run and gun style affair. It's the ideal game for Christmas as we celebrate violence and controversy. Stop. This is the Christmas episode after all. Better lighten things up a bit. Quick, roll that clip of Santa rocking out. Phew, much better. So let's roll back the clock to December 1993 at my house. Dad has walked through the door with the Amiga format magazine Christmas Special. Good times. On the cover we see a Christmas theme and a cover disc. Well, it's only Cannon Soccer, a small yet perfectly formed pre-Christmas treat before the big day. In a holiday crossover, the Cannon Fodder boys take on the Sensible Soccer team that preceded them. I remember getting this edition back in the day. Dad would arrive home and I would always enjoy a good demo disc. Cannon Soccer was particularly worth waiting for. Incidentally, many thanks to Dad for posting this disc off to me first class in time for the episode. 26 years later, and the disc is finally reunited with its original magazine. Okay, I'm just going to take a minute out here to look at the magazine too. As I looked through the magazine for the episode, it was just too good not to share a couple of pages to show what was going on during Christmas 1993. First of all, boom! double-page Jurassic Park game ad, now you know it's 1993. An ad for T2, Alien 3 and Mortal Kombat. What a vintage year. I was hit really hard with nostalgia for this ad though, from The Zone. So I need to explain this one a little. If you were gaming back in 1993, your choice of buying games here in the UK was either mail order, Toys R Us, Boots, yes similar to Walgreens in the US, or independent toy stores. When it came to the high street though, it was the emerging game versus The Zone. I really enjoyed The Zone because it had a futuristic theme and their sales were genuinely exciting. If you were there, you'll know what I'm talking about. They also held Amiga game stock late into their run, so my go-to shop of choice. Anyway, there's Christmas guides. This poor girl's been lined up for an Amiga CD32, only £299 British by this point though. Next to it, the Commodore Amiga 1200 for £349.99. The real question here is, why is she using the CD32? It could be that standalone release of Diggers that swung it for her. There's the usual raft of mail order game adverts. Oh cool, Simon the Sorcerer is coming, I'll keep an eye out for that one. Frontier Elite 2, Turrican 3, only 77%? That's a bit harsh. The Settlers, 94%. Incidentally, this was going to be my Christmas special this year, until I'd sunk in too many hours into Cannon Fodder, of which gets some prime advertising in the magazine. An article on game piracy, even a young Peter Molyneux has his say. There's guides for Flashback, and of course the Cannon Fodder review of 95%. You then of course get that controversial edition of Amiga Power thrown into the bundle. Public domain distributors using size 2 font? Oh yes, now this is Christmas. But I digress. The magazine gives you a 2-page spread of Cannon Soccer. Now remember, this was the same month as the main game's release, so until now the masses had no idea what all the fuss was about. This was the initial Cannon Fodder taster for many gamers. A rather tasty starter indeed. The game demo is essentially broken down into 2 scenarios, Land of Hope and Glory and It's Snow Time. Let's first have a look at Land of Hope and Glory. It's incredibly tricky as you work your way down the pitch, taking out the opposition. The main annoyance here being the helicopter. It's rather persistent as it spams you with grenades. I'd highly recommend taking only one soldier at a time. Your only hope is to wait until it lands inside the centre circle, and then pounce on it with a grenade of your own. It's rather easier said than done, but gives you that feeling of Christmas joy when you manage it. There's also a nice touch that the goalie has a rocket launcher. How Christmassy. It's Snow Time is even harder and much more like the main game itself. A real challenge, again all due to that helicopter. The game content was just right for those pre-Christmas days off from school. Small but a very decent and addictive challenge. So what can I say about Cannon Fodder? It really is a long-term favourite of mine. It's simple, fun, has an interesting story and a creative team behind it. The clean sweeps of 90% plus reviews of the day are more than deserved in my opinion. There is a Cannon Fodder 2 from the Sensible team that is also very much worth checking out. It's basically more of the same with more locations and varied level design. There is also a 2012 Cannon Fodder 3. However, this was not developed by the Sensible team, and I can honestly say that it really doesn't match the charm and good honest fun of the originals. For a game that is primarily based on an anti-war message, Cannon Fodder does a remarkable job of being fun yet memorable for all the right reasons, despite the controversial baggage that it gathered at launch. Over the years, I've had hours of fun with this one, and one of my favourites to revisit as I did when I was younger at Christmas. I think perhaps to wrap up, it's best to revisit the game manual. Yes, it's all very helpful and written with a great sense of humour, as you would expect from a cheeky British team, but also ends on a rather important note. It reads, "And on a more serious note, don't try playing this at home, kids, because war is not a game. War, as Cannon Fodder demonstrates in its own quirky little way, is a senseless waste of human resources and lives. We hope that you never have to find out the hard way." And with that in mind, I wish happy and peaceful holidays to all, whatever piece of antique machinery you may be gaming on this Christmas. Happy gaming, and I'll see you all in the new year. Hello again, I hope you enjoyed today's show and thank you for the view. Remember, you can always comment, like, subscribe and find us on the social media sites below. Happy collecting!